a big chunk of the Republican establishment and the conservative movement bought into Fukuyama end of history thinking and mistook what Charles Krauthammer called a unipolar moment for
Mm-hmm.
a permanent global reality. And so that, in a sense, on the conservative side, there was a sort of as also on the liberal side, there was a collapse among elites in this idea of that there was an American people with a national interest that wasn't necessarily the same as everyone else's. And that, so that to build so that you had George W. Bush second inaugural, you read that speech, it's the most, Woodrow Wilson would not have dared to say some of the things that W said in that speech in terms of the fusion of American values, American interests, and global interests. And then on the economic side, you certainly had sort of a lot of corporations saying, we're not really an American corporation, we're a global corporation,
Right.
right? And our stakeholders are universal, and so on and so forth. And so in both parties and in all wings of American part, and this was also true in people's sort of business careers and personal lives, that you had a generation of elites thinking that, the way to a prosperous future is to kind of leave the rest of America behind and become so cosmopolitan and outward facing that you can reap the rewards of this new thing. And then you had a lot of Americans who weren't in a position to do that or didn't want to do it. And the gap between these, became wider and wider. And a lot of what we're dealing with now is the detritus of that. Because on the one hand, it turned out that dream was wrong. That the world was not about to become a kind of democratic, post-historical, liberal capitalist paradise on the one side. And on the other, that the kind of, it turned out that economically free trade with China under the way China would conduct it was not either going to make China democratic or the world safer, et cetera. So there's to a very large extent, some of the assumptions that underlay the Republican vision, the establishment Republican vision, need to be seriously rethought. And at the same now a lot of people who kind of felt the growing gap between this sort of neoconservative foreign policy rhetoric and neoliberal economic rhetoric, have come up with, going back into American history, sort of stuff that more belongs to William Jennings Bryan than Teddy Roosevelt or William McKinley or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think to try, I think we've got to respect that while those things, I don't think our national future can be secured by that stuff. They did see something that the establishment didn't see. They saw that the emperor had no clothes. They didn't know what to dress him in or who should take his place. And I think that leads to a very different kind of way of building a new conversation, which I think we need.
All right. So picking up on that, I mean, there are a lot of places, a lot of directions I could go with all that. But I'm assuming you don't have 6 or 7 hours so we can really flesh this out. So the bet in the 1990s, look, first of all, I agree with you, just to get it on the record, I agree with you that there were a lot of people who thought all you had to do was scratch the surface of Iraqi man or Iranian man or Russian man, and underneath you would find democratic man. And that was a mistake. Cultures matter. National interests matter, all that kind of stuff. But on the bet with trade with China, I also agree with you that certainly in retrospect was not handled. Like, I don't think anybody would replay the movie the same way if they could do it again. At the same time, when people argue that China is destined to be, our new opponent in a Cold War, and I think we are in a small c, small w Cold War already with them, and China hawkishness is going to be the nature of our foreign policy towards China for a very long time. The only question will be whether it's smart hawkishness or dumb hawkishness. At the same time, when I look at China, like, I think they were an immediate and medium term obvious threat, challenge, whatever label you want to put on it. At the same time, I would not want to have China's problems. And there does seem to be this sort of tendency to make straight line projections off into the future about how things are going to look. You would not have bet that China would look like this 20 years ago. I'm not sure it looks like this 20 years from now. I think you have to prepare for the possibility that it is, because that's the more dangerous one. But I mean, we used to say China is going to get old before it gets rich, and it's the racist seems to be kind of on that front right now. Where do you see China in the medium and long term? And also, I've had this debate with Neil Ferguson. He's a friend. I like him, but I think he was just very wrong to say we're like the Soviet Union today. And, but it is true, and I think he's more right on the foreign policy stuff than on the domestic stuff. But it is true that China is not like the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was not a cultural, it was not an economic threat to us the way that China is. It wasn't an economic competitor the way China is. Is there a historical analogy that's better than the Soviet Union in the Cold War for how we should be viewing China? Is it Prussia in the 19th century? I mean, or is it just an unprecedented situation?
Well, obviously, that's a big and complicated set of questions that you're asking.
I just got to get them all out there, and then you can just pick ones you want to pick.
Get back to the root, though, let's remember that the trade errors of the 90s weren't just about China. NAFTA was going to consolidate democracy in Mexico and solve the problems of our southern border by creating so much employment in Mexico that immigration would actually decrease. So we have to understand that the establishment in both parties, including the kind of heirs of Reagan that were running the Republican Party, fundamentally misjudged some basic policy questions. And, and that sense of they were wrong. And yet, the Republicans have never really had the kind of discussion of what went wrong in Iraq or what went wrong over NAFTA, et cetera, that, and if left to itself, the Republican establishment would just have sailed on past all of this, giving each other social promotions and raises and hire new jobs forever, right? And that is the kind of affront that broke the party. Not so much the initial errors as the demonstration that the system, the establishment system, and even, let's be frank, intelligentsia, was just not willing to do the hard work of rethinking. And so in that sense, what the sort of Trumpian populists are forcing us to do now is the task that we could have done under much easier circumstances with better results. All right. And I think we need to internalize that. If you don't learn from your mistakes, you're likely to repeat them. And I think that, and a certain, I still note a kind of, condescension and the haut en bas sort of thing of, we have the true tradition, you're a bunch of lunkheads thing. That's just not the way to do this. It's just not, I don't think. Well, I'm not saying you're doing it, by the way, John.
Yeah, no, I get it. I know, no. And look, I said up front, I think some of the nationalist guys who fly the nationalist flag are very smart, sophisticated people who make smart and sophisticated arguments. And then there are a lot of lunkheads who, buy into some of the national
Right.
stuff without thinking it through in any way.
But in
Similarly,
part because they're sort of the people that they could have looked to for sort of instruction and enlightenment were recycling cliches rather than rethinking issues. So,
no, look, I think that's right. Look, at National Review, we made the argument for 50 years, something like that, that if responsible politicians don't deal with the immigration problem responsibly,
right.
irresponsible politicians will come forward and use it as a political issue. Trump proved that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can make that same analogous argument,
Right.
about trade stuff and all of these kinds of things. I mean, I'm still, generically speaking, a free trader. Those are my priors.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think free trade with China makes a hell of a lot of sense, and I'm willing to countenance all sorts of tariff stuff about China because China is a national security threat. I don't really care much about the the national the I don't think the arguments for putting tariffs on Scotch whiskey, which is affecting me greatly, is a very strong one. And
might be good for you, Jonah. Might be good for
it
you.
might be, but the heart wants what the heart wants. But and and as you said, just to sort of, because I'm anticipating the responses from many of my listeners, who are going to rally to your side on some of these things. I think when you said before about how the emperor having no clothes, I think that is fair comment. But you also said that the people who wanted to, who pointed it out, had no idea how to dress the emperor, the naked emperor. And I do not put a lot of stock in people like, I don't know, Peter Navarro, and or Matt Gaetz and that crowd for coming up with thoughtful, solutions to these very thorny problems. Now, Elbridge Colby, I think he's a very smart guy, and and I take him seriously even when I disagree with him, because I think he's a very sophisticated, serious guy who takes this stuff seriously. So you make these sorts of distinctions, but I think I'm on very solid ground when I say that the future looks like it's going to, with respect to China at least, the debate's going to be between dumb hawkishness and smart hawkishness, and I am not confident that the smart hawks are going to win in a lot of those arguments.
Well, one thing, I mean, I look back at American history, and what I notice is that generally speaking, what we don't resolve, American governance is a bludgeon, not a scalpel. We don't have intense policy debates and come to the nicely judged perfect thing and then brilliantly execute it with the polished machinery of our incredibly effective state. It's just not what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I think it's a curse of us intellectuals to sort of think that, somehow to confuse successful policy process with successful ratiocination, intellectual clarity. Okay. Just to give a historical argument, I'm not sure we would have had a Marshall Plan if we hadn't had McCarthyism.
Mm-hmm.
That to get Americans really scared enough about communism to get the Marshall Plan through a very reluctant Congress, and NATO for that matter, you had to have a degree of fear in the public at large distributed along the bell curve, which meant
Mm-hmm.
that you had a significant group of people so over the top about it that there was a cost to it. And I think a lot of American history has to be understood in that way, that it's not a process of taking either the right step and things go well or the wrong step and things go badly, but this sort of movement of a colossal, disparate group of free people, each moving in their own pace by their own lights in their own way. You have great good and great evil moving together often.